we spent the afternoon in our evangelism team meeting talking about what we can do, right? Being involved. And one of the things that we're trying to emphasize in those meetings, especially as we go forward, and it's important for us to be mindful in the church, is that we're not going to be doing the same things. And because we're not all doing the same things does not mean that we're not working for the same cause. But there's a lot of different ways of approaching different aspects of a job that need to be done. And there are different needs that we have with every task involved in the church, especially that of evangelism. Well, we've been studying throughout the life of Moses, and we've learned a lot from his life. And I spent, I believe, 3 weeks complaining about complaining. And complaining about when people complain, right? And there was a lot of that. And sometimes I think about when we talk about negativity, it's an awful negative thing to say that's awful negative, right? And that's kind of where I was for 3 weeks' time, as we looked at those 40 years in the wilderness, and we looked at how many times the people were griping and complaining and lashing out towards Moses and towards God. And some of the lessons that we gleaned from that were to remind us of the blessings we have from God, the perspective that we want to have and pursuing God with recognizing our blessings and the impact that we have on one another. Well, tonight we look at Moses on the other side of that complaining. And we will try to glean the lesson from him of what we do when success depends on you and your hands are weary. Now, in the church, it is important, and this is something that came out in our meetings today several times, for us to remember that success ultimately belongs to God, depends on God. But the fact of the matter is, on the other side of that very same coin, is God does not snap his fingers and made things happen. That's how he created the world, right? He didn't snap his fingers. He spoke, and it was. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And the fact of the matter is that he could accomplish all the work of the church in the same way if he chose to do it that way. But he hasn't chose to do it that way. He has chosen to use you and I and his people to accomplish his work. Kevin read for us from Exodus, the 17th chapter, and he read that passage, I think, 8 to 16, if I'm not mistaken. And we have there this battle against the Amalekites. And Moses sends Joshua down to fight the Amalekites. And God tells Moses to raise his hands, the staff of God, up. And I believe that, at least in part, his upward raised hands with the staff of God is a very close parallel to lifting his voice up in prayer to God. He's relying on God. But as he lowers his hands, and I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, as his hands are raised, Joshua and the army of Israel force Amalekites back, and they win the battle. But as Moses' hands become weary, and we see that in verse 12, but Moses' hands grew weary. And so his hands would lower, and the Amalekites would begin to win the battle. There was an important role that Moses played. Success in that way depended on Moses. It was the Lord's battle. But Moses had a part to play. And his hands grew weary. I think as we come into the book of Numbers, that we can see that Moses grew weary throughout this 40 years in many ways. As we see him cracking under the pressure, it would seem, as he strikes the rock twice and says, "Let us produce, or must we produce water for you rebels?" Moses had grown weary. And so we want to look at his life and then learn some lessons from that. What do we do when we grow weary? How can we continue to do the work of the Lord, to meet the obligations that we have of us in this life? Certainly, leaders grow weary. When I say leaders, I sometimes wonder how many of us kind of separate ourselves from that term leader. But we each have a leadership role. Parents are leaders. And parents, I think you can probably relate to the picture. I said Christians, and Christian's head pops up from the computer back there, thinking there's a problem. But Christians can grow weary. If we're doing the work that Jesus has asked us to do, we are going to grow weary. There's going to come a time where we don't feel as though we can move forward. And allow me to pause here. And I talk about leaders growing weary, and I said we're all leaders in so many ways. It was wonderful to see Christian and Naomi sitting in our evangelism team meeting today. Not back with some of the younger children, but sitting there attentively. And I'd asked them specifically in weeks past to do that because they are leaders. They are leaders of the youth. And Naomi, as I believe you're in Hawk Hall, and Christian in the back, there's going to be times where you want to shirk away from that responsibility. There's going to be times where your figurative hands are weary. But it's important that you lead in the way that God has designed you and asked you to lead. Of course, we've noted already that even Moses, the great leader that he was, grew weary under the stresses of, grew weary under the burden that he was carrying. Why? Because Moses got stressed out. You ever think of Moses that way? We all get stressed out, right? There are times when the stress gets the best of us. Linda, you ever get stressed? You ever tell Paul, leave me alone? Don't even talk to me. I can't put up with you right now. Yeah, I know what you say to him, not because I've heard you, but well, I know for other reasons. I wasn't eavesdropping on you, right? Moses got stressed out. And it's important for us to realize that the greatest leaders of Scripture got stressed out. Look here what we read in 12 and 13, if you would, of Exodus, the 17th chapter. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put under him, and he sat on it while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steadied until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and the people with the edge of the sword. So here we have Moses, and I looked on Google Images for a long time before I found it, what I thought was a picture that surely is somewhat accurate. Does Moses look comfortable in that picture? No, because he held his hands up until they became so weary he couldn't raise them anymore. Can you imagine what he must have felt as his hands become fatigued? And now he's holding the staff of the Lord, But it wouldn't matter if you held just a pin. Holding your hands out or upward for a period of time is something that is taxing. Can you imagine what Moses must have felt as his hands give way under the burden? And he watches his own people begin to lose the battle. Let's not filter it too much. When Amalek is pushing back against Israel, it surely would have meant that the Israelites are losing lives. Think that's a stressful situation? And so they get the rocks, and they put rocks under his arms. And then they get Aaron and Hur on each side of him, and they hold his hands up. Now, that would have mechanically kept his hands up, but I'm sure we've all had enough experience with this sort of situation that we would know how uncomfortable this would have been. I hadn't been to the dentist in several years, and I went to the dentist, and I had some work to be done, and the dentist was saying, this is going to cost this much, and this is what I want to do. And I said, listen, I don't want to talk about price. It needs done. So let's get it done. And he said, all right. And he said, well, we'll do this in 4 visits. I said, no, you see, that's my concern. I came in here because I have an issue. I want the issue fixed. I don't want to keep coming back. It's hard for me to get the time to come back in here. He says, you want to do it all in 1 visit? I says, yes. He said, when? I said, preferably right now. Whew, just something as simple as holding your mouth open can become taxing, right? Well, I was going to let him know, Mike, that I was thinking I made a mistake. and I don't think he was about to let me have a break after that little speech, right? But Moses became stressed out because of the burden that he was under. His time became constrained. If you would look over here in the 18th chapter in verses 14 through 18. Exodus 18, starting in 14. When Moses, his father-in-law, saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand around you from morning till evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a dispute, they come to me, and I decide between one person and another, and I make them know the statutes of God and his laws. Moses' father-in-law said to him, what you are doing is not good. Verse 18, you and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You are not able to do it alone. You know what Moses is here? Is he's the judge for all 600,000 plus men, plus women and children. Estimates that I've seen are somewhere between 1.5 as high as 6 million people. And Moses is judging them seemingly from the smallest of disputes to the most serious of matters. Jethro says to him, what are you doing? Moses says, well, I'm settling the disputes that they're bringing to me. Notice here, they're standing around Moses day and night. You ever feel as though someone's always grabbing at you, always needs something from you? Yeah, I'm sure we've all felt that way from time to time. Moses literally has this situation, and notice Jethro says to Moses that what you're doing is not good. You're going to wear yourself out, and you're going to wear the people out. Now, we understand what that's like, right? We've all tried to use government agencies to do this or that, and we understand what it's like to wait forever for something. What are we, 2 months into a pandemic and we still don't have adequate testing? Amanda was reading today and telling me that the FDA shut down again, private interest, just this past week. They're going to say, no, you're going to get from the government or nowhere else. Well, that's not how we've got much accomplished in this country ever, right? It's been private industry that's supported us, and here we are still waiting, right? Well, that's the way these people are with Moses. They're going to wait in line forever. His time was constrained. Thirdly, he got stressed out because, this might be a surprise to you, his patience grew thin. Or you get the impression that one thing leads to another. If you would turn over to Deuteronomy, the 9th chapter. Deuteronomy 1. And what's interesting is that Deuteronomy, remember the book Leviticus, the root there is Levi, or the Levitical code, the law. Deuteronomy, deutero, is two, or the second giving of the law. So the law was given at Mount Sinai for the first time, and then Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law at the end of the 40 years when the people are about to enter the promised land. And so at the beginning of this reading, or of the second giving of the law, verses 9 through 12, this is what Moses writes. At that time I said to you, I am not able to bear you by myself. The Lord your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are today as numerous as the stars of heaven. May the Lord, the God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times as many as you are, and bless you as he promised you. How can I bear by myself the weight and burden of you and your strife? So seemingly talking about the same time that we just read about Jethro, now Moses writes and he says, how am I to bear all of these burdens? I think, and we'll come back to this in a few moments, but I think it's worth noting that we ought to strive to, as best we can, understand and be helpful to our leaders. I said some pretty critical things just a few moments ago about our government, right? I stand by those statements. I believe them. But our elected officials, as many flaws as they have, are in very difficult times, and particularly right now. I mentioned this morning the very difficult task of having to be involved with the board meeting yesterday and canceling in-person camp for PCC. You know, one thing I was certain of is that being on that board, it didn't matter whether we had camp or we didn't have camp. There were going to be people mad at the board, the people responsible for making those decisions. And there are going to be people express those. Now, that's part of being a leader, any kind of leader. Even you youngsters, Christian and Naomi that I was talking to earlier, there's going to come criticism with your leadership. But as we see this picture of the great burden on their shoulders, we ought to be mindful of that. I have looked back over my life at the many times that I unintentionally put additional burdens on leaders' shoulders that I regret. Moses is dealing with a lot, and he was stressed out. Now, as we bring this full circle, and I kind of talked about this idea we were going to learn from, we see some of these examples where Moses' hands were weary. And we consider what is it like, or what should I do when my hands are weary? Number one, as I just said to Christian and Naomi, and each one of us will understand, we are going to receive criticism. I think of David, when the people of Israel are at battle with the Philistines, and every day this Goliath, giant Goliath, comes out and he mocks the Israelite people and he mocks the Israelites' God. And finally, David is sent to check on his brothers and to take them some food. And he shows up and he looks down in the valley and he sees Goliath mocking Israel, mocking God. What's going on here? And so they explain to him, well, you see that we don't have a warrior to go down and fight Goliath. And David doesn't seem to miss a beat. He says, I'll fight him. I'll go down there and take care of him. You know what he had a lot of? Critics. You know who everyone that was criticizing him was? The people that should have been taking care of the problem in the first place. We need to analyze the criticism we get. There's almost always lessons we can learn, things we can improve upon. But we need to understand that there's just going to be criticism. And that's part of getting things done. I've said recently, and not about myself, but I've worked with other congregations and with camp and things. I've mentioned to my friend Stevens, he works with the School of Preaching there in West Virginia, that it seems as though sometimes the only action not criticized in the church is inaction. The moment someone does something, we can find something wrong with it, because there's always a way it could have been done a little bit better, right? But the action, what should be criticized the most, is inaction. Paul was criticized in 2 Corinthians, the 10th chapter. He was real, this is just one verse. But in 2 Corinthians 10:10, I believe there, the Corinthians are saying, oh, his letters are mighty, but his flesh is weak. He sure is a lot stronger, we'd say, over text message than he is in person. They criticized his authority. They criticized his wisdom, right? They were constantly throwing rocks at him. Even Jesus was criticized constantly. He's a wine bibber. He eats with sinners. He breaks the Sabbath. He's of the devil. Constant. My point being that we're always going to receive criticism. And I tell my children this, and I try and remind myself of this all the time. Anytime you're criticized, you need to find what you can use out of that criticism. Even if it's just someone else's perspective. But as we move forward, and as we consider ourselves, as our hands grow weary under the burdens that we carry, I believe that we see that Jesus demonstrates there are only two appropriate responses to criticism. And bearing in mind that none of the criticism leveled at Jesus was legitimate. It was all improper. But yet we see two appropriate responses. One was to face it directly, to address it directly. And the other, Dean, I think I know enough about your personality. I think you might struggle with this as much as I do. Because in your day, you were a scrappler, right? A scrapper. You know what the second appropriate response is? You just ignore it completely. It's okay to ignore it sometimes and not even address it. Let it go. Now, that's hard for me. I struggle with that one. But as Christians, as people that are striving to do our best to take the gospel of Christ, the love of our God to our fellow mankind, there's times where we're just going to need to overlook criticism. Whichever response we use, what we should reiterate, what we should forever be reminded of, what we should know for certain is that it should never be allowed to derail us. Do not allow the criticism of the world. Do not allow the criticism of your friends. Do not allow the criticism of your fellow Christians, your family, or anyone else derail the work that God has put before you. Secondly, our hands can grow weary under criticism, just like Moses's did. But secondly, our hands can grow weary, just like Moses's did, from overscheduling. There is a time where we have to understand that it's okay to say no. Good-hearted people struggle with this, to say no. And the fact of the matter is, I'm going to glance ahead here, that we can't get everything done. And when we try to do everything, it's not good. It's not good for me. It's not good for you. It's not good for the people that we're trying to get it done. One of the reasons our hands may be weary is that we've simply overscheduled. I think in our society today, this is a big one. This is a big reason that we oftentimes grow weary. We're going to talk about the solutions to these. When our hands grow weary, we need to listen to Jethro. Now, notice the people that Moses had around him. Aaron, Hur, and Jethro. Each one of these people are incredibly important people. When we understand, I said about overscheduling ourselves and not doing everything ourselves, I think the very first start there is to understand that we need good advisors. This phone is precious to me. I mean that sincerely. It is precious. The most valuable thing I have in this phone is my contact list. And probably so many of you have been around me and you've asked me a question. And I said, I don't know, but I know who would know. Right? And I'll make a phone call or I'll send a text, right? Having people around us, good advisors. And sometimes I think we're mistaken in thinking that we can have one good advisor that tells us what to do in every situation. Jethro told Moses, surround yourself with many other judges. Right? I want to have someone, an advisor that is strong in real estate law, an advisor that's strong in tort law, an advisor that's strong in finances, an advisor that's strong in relationships or a particular kind of relationship. Surround yourself with good people. Surround yourself with the type of people that won't tear you down, because we'll have lots of those in the world. Moses had them all around him. But we need to surround ourselves with people that will build us up. We need to be good time managers as Christians. We need to remember what is important and to make sure that those things get done. We need to evaluate our priorities and to understand that very often times, and we are blessed to be able to say so, we are deciding between good and better. You see, those decisions that between good and bad are easy, right? The bad just doesn't get done. Well, I'm not going to waste my time over there. If that was the decision we were always facing, we'd never be overscheduled. But oftentimes we have to decide between good and better. I'll share with you, I did share with you at the beginning of the year that last year I felt with the church that I just ran this way and that way and really wasn't certain what I got accomplished. We did a lot of good things. We're involved with a lot of good projects and things. I took some time the beginning of this month, and I was grateful that the office was redone and bright white walls. And I placed myself, I had no idea quarantine was coming, or I'd have thought about this differently. But I sat myself in this office and I said, I'm going to think before I act. I'm going to evaluate what the best things that I can be putting my time into. And like I said, I didn't know I was going to get locked in the office for a couple of months, or I'd have just put that off. But thankfully, and I don't claim wisdom, I truly believe it's providence of God, some of the things that came out of those things were redoing our entire live streaming situation. And the time that got put into that, which has served us so well. We need to be mindful of what took place in Acts 6, where there was a need for deacons. And so they assigned people for deacons because the apostles said, what should we quit? Spreading the word? That's my own living translation. Should we quit spreading the word to serve tables? We need to have advisors. We need to have good time management. We need to evaluate our priorities. We need to have not just our Jethros, our good advisors around us, but we need Aaron and Hur around us. The people, that's not a real glamorous job, is it? Moses gets all the credit, and there's Aaron and Hur standing holding his arms up. You think about the position that you're in, that's not even a pleasant position to be in, holding those arms up. We need Aaron and Hur's. Started by talking about the fact that we're all going to do different jobs. Not all the jobs are glamorous, but some of those less glamorous jobs are the most important jobs in the entire world, in the entire church. We need to have Barnabases, right, that were encouragers, that root us on, that say, keep going. Don't stop. Keep pushing forward. We need to have Barnabases in our lives. Paul ended nearly each one of his epistles with a long list of people that helped him, that supported him, that served the needs of Christ in so many different ways. And lastly, let me suggest to you that we should strive to be one another's Jethros. That we should strive to be one another's Aaron and Hur's. And one another's Barnabas. So that we're able to help one another when our hands grow weary. Above all else, I'll leave you with 2 verses from Galatians, the 6th chapter. Galatians 6:2 says, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. The 2nd verse is just 9th verse, just a few verses later. Verse 9 says, grow not weary of doing good. Brethren, strive to carry one another's burden, and don't ever grow weary of doing good. This evening, as we conclude, if you have a spiritual need of any. And if you're here publicly or privately, why do those motorcycles have to be so loud? I can tell you they scare the deer away, those pipes. I have loud pipes, so I'll have to stick them up for him. It's okay when I'm riding it, not so okay when he's outside. If you have a spiritual need tonight, if you're here in person, as we sing this invitation song, make that known. If you're with us on live stream, I encourage you not to hesitate to reach out, whether it's to call, to email, to leave a message on the live chat. Please make that need known. Allow us to help you to be closer to Christ as together we stand and sing.